Hello, Dr. Castor. I am in the basement of my house in Oakdale, Minnesota. Um, I appreciate you taking the time to watch my presentation, and I'm really hoping I can keep it under 5 minutes, but I am really happy with what I have done, and I don't want to overshare. So, thank you again for taking the time to listen. Let's get into it. The name of my presentation, Fall Away from the World, and falling onto and into Jesus. I feel like that is all-encompassing term for what I wanted to talk about today. So yeah, to kind of talk a little more about falling into the world. Kevin DeYoung has a great quote in his book, Do Not Be True to Yourself, where he says, the most important decision you being a college student, a new college student, will make is whether you go to church the first Sunday when nobody is there to make sure you go. I love this for a bunch of reasons, but one particular thing that stands out to me is later on in his book, he talks about whether or not students are prepared to make that decision, whether they're spiritually in a place to want to continue growing, leaving high school, leaving their family and this and that, with parents and siblings not there to hold them accountable. Will they make that decision? So understanding integrity and also identifying that our identity is in Jesus, not anything else, not in the world, definitely shouldn't be in the world, but primarily in Jesus, full stop, period. So yeah, let's talk a little more about that as we go on. God, is that from you? This slide is just kind of talking about desires and discernment. One of which being specifically in desires of like having a holy desire, like wanting kids, whereas that could be twisted into a desire of the flesh to be like, I want kids because that's how I get to have a bunch of sex and I just want sex, which is unfortunately the reality in some people's cases. But creating an environment where you can encourage discussion and eliminate confusion, especially in cases of discernment, is something that I heard from a bunch of different authors while researching and kind of brought together into this specific phrase, encouraging discussion, eliminating confusion. Encouraging discussion just meaning creating a space where it's not weird to ask questions. Students aren't scared to ask questions. It's okay to be wrong sometimes. It's okay to not know something. And then eliminating confusion in the sense that, like, in this global online world where anybody with a bad take can go online and say like, oh, you know what, Jesus wasn't actually God, he was just a prophet. So not only preparing your students to be able to discern when something is wrong, in the case of like Brandon Robertson, who's like a gay affirming pastor, and like a student can be like, okay, I know that's wrong. Whereas someone like Mike Winger, who even I personally have had moments of like, you know what, I don't think that's true. So then I have to research it on my own. So teaching students to do the same thing in your ministries is just as important. Um, uh, Primarily just in terms of relationships, we are never ever meant to go through Christianity, to go through faith and spiritual growth alone. So creating an environment where students can have relationships built on Christ is super important and something that should be implemented in every single youth group, no questions asked, completely. One thing that I wanted to talk about additionally is not only the relationships between students of the same age, but like the rest of the church. So being involved in the church. I heard something great that I used to struggle with about tithing, which was I wasn't making any money, so I felt badly that I couldn't tithe. But that being said, something I heard from someone much wiser than I said, if you're not making any money, 10% of zero is zero. But what that means is that you should try to find ways to be involved in other places of the church, things like vacation Bible school or leadership opportunities, whether that for some students might look like helping on tech team. For other students, it's volunteering in kids' church so they can run that smoothly, as well as individual contribution, whether that's janitorial help, like randomly, if you can spare the time, sort of thing. Especially if you have the time, these are things that you should encourage your students to do. Additionally, all students should be welcome no matter what. I feel like that's not a controversial thing whatsoever. All students should just be welcome to come and hear about Jesus every single time. for adults and adulting, as I kind of mentioned before, I think adults have a special place in youth ministry, strangely enough, as leaders, being those Christ-like images to some students who maybe don't have a father figure, whatever it is, if you're in kind of a slummy neighborhood. Unfortunately, that's just the case for some students. So as Titus 2 talks about, which is why I have it on here, older men are supposed to be sober-minded, dignified, self-controlled, sound in faith, and love and in steadfastness, whereas older women, blah, 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 all these things that are like things to strive for or just straight up not do. And then verse 6, likewise, urge the younger men to be self-controlled. Show yourself in all respects to be a model of good works, and in your teaching show integrity and dignity. I just think that's super important, not only for being able to teach, like it says in verse 6, teach them. In verse 2, it talks about how you're supposed to be a certain way. You're supposed to be learning. You're supposed to be sober-minded and self-controlled. So not only are you telling them to be self-controlled, you have to be self-controlled yourself. So encouraging leaders and making sure your leaders are Christ-like and increasing in their walk with Jesus. And then personally, I just had a story I wanted to tell, which I was just going to read straight up because I think it's important. While in high school, I asked Nate, a leader in our group, a question he did not know the answer to. Instead of deferring to Zach, who is our youth pastor, or just saying something like, "Oh, I'll get back to you," or whatever, he said, "No, let's do this together. I want to learn with you." And I would argue in that moment, his willingness to learn was more important than his knowledge of what I was asking about. And I asked about something that I didn't think he knew about, and I guess I was right. But in that moment, it didn't matter what he did know; it was what he didn't know. So the opportunity he had to share with me to be like, nah, let's do this together was absolutely incredible. So I think leaders being able to do things like that with their students and show Christ-like faith and like a willingness to learn and this and that is just super important. Read your bleeping Bible. But I blank. I feel like we often hear students come up with excuses, and of course, some of them are real. Some people have, but I have sports, but I have homework, but I'm just too busy, whatever. But I feel like we need to be encouraging students, and something I overwhelmingly heard is like having the resilience, maybe not to read an entire book of the Bible per day or whatever it is, or even per week, but just reading a few verses a day, having that conviction and building the resilience to read every single day. I'm sorry if you can hear my cat. He's meowing right now. But building the routine, that's why things like Bible in a year are super cool. I love that. Bible studies, having like a one night a week just to get with other believers and talk about the Bible is super awesome. One of the other two things I wanted to touch on was having extra Bibles. I feel like groups often have extra Bibles, but do not use them as effectively as they could, whether that's just handing them out to new students if a new student shows up or whatever it is. Obviously, every church is in a different situation financially. Some of them just can't afford to do that. But I feel as though if you can, you should be. Especially where do I start? For those newer believers, for those students that are like, you know what, I've never sat down and read the Bible before. Where do I start? Genesis is a terrible place to start. Of course, it's the beginning, so it's like a moderately good place to start, but it is such a slog to get through Genesis, and many a Bible plans have died on the shores of Deuteronomy, even if they make it through Genesis and Exodus, right? So I think it's important to point them to the New Testament, to hear the gospel, maybe for the first time. Reading it, I think, is effective, even more so than having somebody tell it to you. To read it on the page is super cool. So to encourage students to be like John, Matthew, Luke, to start in those books where you can hear the gospel, pointing them in that direction, I think is super important. So, yeah. So just kind of a recap about some goals. I think having an identity in Christ, building that identity throughout your youth group, to say like not only is our church, our group, and have an identity in Christ, but each individual student does as well. Discerning truth and lies. With so much misinformation that's on media, it's important for students to be able to be willing to ask questions and question ideas and think through them on their own instead of just believing whatever they're told. Relationships within the church, being involved in the church is super important, as well as having those God-centered, faith-based relationships with other students of their age or adults that they're trusting. Again, number 4, Christ-like adult leaders. Super important to have leaders in your group and in your church, specifically adults, of course, that are willing and capable of learning alongside students, whether that's hosting Bible studies or inviting to a community group every once in a while, or even just having a barbecue, showing that love that adults can show that sometimes teenagers are just incapable of showing is super important. And then last, read the Bible. I beg of you. People do not read the Bible enough. Moving on. Cannot believe I'm at 10 minutes. This is miserable. Really briefly, I just had some resources. I put together some stuff that was for students, and then stuff that was for leaders. Leading from the Second Chair was a ministry specific book, so people who are in youth pastor positions, but I think a lot of what's in there applies also to not student leaders, but adult leaders in ministry as well. So I really appreciated that part of the book. I wish I had more time to talk about this book, but I love this book. It's by Rebecca McLaughlin. I got this book when I graduated. Zach, who was our youth pastor, had just recently read it, and he gave it to me, and he was like, dude, you got to read this. And I read it, and I loved it. And I just think this is a fantastic resource for any student that is like relatively new or just has some hard questions or whatever it is. Like, every student should have read this book at some point in their life. It is fantastic. So, yeah. Finally, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. I realize this went long, and I'm really sorry, but I had so much information, and I loved researching for this project, and I'm very grateful to have learned from you and have taken your class. So thank you, Ken, once again for teaching our class. God bless you and your family. Thank you again.